Right. Okay, so Helen, thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to just look at your questionnaire. So you're a dietitian, you're based in England, and you're specialist in eating disorders. That's right, isn't
that's
it?
correct. Yeah.
Okay. So whenever you kind of outlined your training, you mentioned Well-Now training, and you said that that involved role play and practical tools. So can you give me a bit of an insight about what that training was about and how that helped you?
Yes, so the Well-Now training was about, I think Lucy Aphramore, who designs the training, calls it connected eating. So it's supposed to be a health justice and trauma-informed approach to addressing health issues, particularly eating disorders. So things like binge eating, anorexia nervosa, and things like, weight gain, that kind of thing. So most of the training is centered around how to talk about health behaviors rather than weight itself, and how to get people to kind of reflect on how different eating patterns and different foods make them feel, how different situations and different food patterns might trigger certain feelings, and very much on kind of like the why people eat what they eat rather than the what they eat. So it's more of a therapy focused approach, which requires less direction, so less kind of specific direction from the person who is the health professional, and a more of a facilitator approach to help people kind of come to their own conclusions about different things around food and their relationship with food and things that they use food for and that kind of thing. So it's more about sort of informed choice, I guess, rather than a specific meal pattern or eating regime.
Okay. And when you mentioned the health behavior approach, just tell me a bit more about that. How does that differ from, say, your eating behaviors?
So usually what the approach that we take is we'd take a curious approach. So we'd be asking somebody what was important to them, what were the things that sort of they think that they did well in their life, the things that they found difficult, specific questions about how they eat, kind of food frequent, not like the traditional kind of food diary or things like that, more about kind of like recall, or asking them to think about, reflect on certain meals and certain situations. So it's focused on not asking them to tell us a little bit about how they eat and then how that makes them feel, or how particular movements make them feel, if they exercise, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. So as you say, it's a connected eating, but it's actually connecting their behavior to food and then to their life.
Yeah, it's about how it's sort of embodied experiences. So it's about a whole experience of eating, rather than I ate this and then I felt sluggish. It's sort of like it's more, how do I describe it? It's more about kind of getting them to think about their diet as a whole, and maybe thinking about foods that maybe they're fearful of, or foods that they avoid, and then exploring the reasons why that occurs. Or maybe if they were binge eating, looking at what foods trigger a binge. And then instead of me saying, well, avoid those foods or take those foods out of the house, we look at like what circumstances surround those binges, why those particular foods were chosen, that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Yeah, I feel like I'm being very confusing.
No, you're not. I just got confused. I think it's me, not you. I'll cut that bit out of the interview. I'll not transcribe my confusion. So yeah, and you mentioned that it involved kind of role plays and practical tools. Was that about how to work with the client or patient?
Yeah, it was. And so there were specific, and these are obviously like trademark tools, the similar ones used in things like other approaches like intuitive eating. Lucy, it was quite a while ago now, and I don't use this in my practice mostly, but we did something called the Well-Now Donut, which is a kind of a food exercise. And it's very much around kind of calling foods and talking about the effects of foods on the body and how certain foods make people feel, rather than the calorie content of a food or the nutrient content of a food, if that makes sense.
Okay. And when you were doing role plays, did you do specific scenarios that Patients?
Not really, no. It was more about kind of how we would approach it as a health professional and a facilitator rather than in scenarios.
Okay. And do you think a scenario-based approach would have any benefit? Maybe not say to someone like you who's an experienced practitioner, but say to someone new communicating about weight?
Yeah, I think so. I think so, but I think it would be, the scenarios maybe want to be with people who are of a higher weight rather than with other healthcare professionals, is my view on that.
Realistic scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay. And then there's a question on the questionnaire about where you get your information, kind of ongoing learning. I couldn't quite make that one out. Where would you go for ongoing learning?
So I tend to go to, for weight-related conversations, I look to a group called Critical Dietetics, which is about health equity and health-centered approaches, about embodied approaches rather than prescriptive approaches, if that makes sense. So valuing people's experiences and patient expertise, and not using science to inform decisions, but not using science to silence experiences. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's what Critical Dietetics is usually about. There's a forum of paper sharing and textbook and a website and that kind of thing. I use Evelyn Tribole's intuitive eating framework. Their professional groups, that kind of thing. I look to obviously new papers in the area of kind of intuitive eating on diet, that sort of thing.
Okay, so the critical dietetics, that's part of that whole kind of critical pedagogy literature, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's all really about patient-informed
mm-hmm.
kind of experience, and okay, that makes sense. So then moving on to the second area, which is really about opportunities to discuss weight. And again, you're an ED-related dietitian, so this might not entirely apply to you. So the broad question is, tell me how you currently talk to patients about weight.
So I don't talk about weight because I'm usually dealing with anorexia as the main condition that I deal with. Okay. Even then, the conversations that I occasionally, and this is rare in my practice because I'm an outpatient ED practitioner, so a lot of the people with anorexia that I deal with are not working towards a weight target, but just working generally on their condition and food fears and things like that. But if I do on a rare occasion have somebody that I need to give a weight target to, I will put that into context of health. So I would put it in context of the effect that their lower weight is having on their organs, on their bones, their hormones, that kind of thing, and talk to them about their fears around weight gain.
Yes.
And ask them about how they feel about that. That I try really hard not to work with numbers with people with anorexia, though. It's only on very, it's different for every single person. So for some people it's necessary and it works well, but for other people it really doesn't. And I prefer to lean towards not mentioning it if I can work that way, because it in the long term works out better.
I can see that possibly anorexia is a very different type of weight related conversation. I think
sorry. I do talk. Sorry. It's okay. It's my fault. I have spoken about weight with people with binge eating disorder occasionally, because it's not because I've brought it up as a concern, but they brought it up as a concern, particularly related to their condition. And in those instances, we refocus the conversation around improving the behaviours and the mental health condition that lead to those behaviours, rather than focusing on the weight.
So patients actually bring that subject up because it's a fear. It's part of the concern they have.
Yeah, and that happens in anorexia as well, with weight gain. Yeah.
Okay. And then specific language that you would use when you talk about weight. I mean, do you? Some of the literature talks about asking patients and clients what terms they want to use. I mean, what's your kind of perspective on that?
So I find the idea of asking people a very tricky idea. As a practitioner, I'm a bit more intuitive than that, I would say. I'm not, my view on it is that whenever I tend to reflect the person and the way that the person's talking to me, so I use the language that they're using. If I'm talking in a public health, from a public health perspective, I try to use the least kind of triggering, I guess, term. I know that obviously there's no perfect term for weight, and different people find different things acceptable or triggering or whatever. So I tend to use words to higher weight and lower weight rather than specific terms if I'm talking in a general sense. But I guess I'm trying to think of yeah, I don't know. Is
there any specific language you would definitely avoid? I
think language is so subjective. I would never avoid any single term. I think that there's a lot of debate obviously around language, and there's certain things that I agree with and certain things I don't, but I try not to use the term obese. Yeah. Because of my personal views on that and on obesity as a disease and that kind of thing. But I also respect that some people prefer that terminology. So there's nothing that I really avoid. I just try and adapt my language to the situation. And I guess when I'm not dealing with it in the sense of like a GP might want to, like, and I don't like these interventions, but every contact counts in the interventions and stuff where they're raising it before the person's raised it, whereas I work very much from a perspective of talking about what's important to people, about their lifestyle and things that they are doing day to day, and asking questions and being curious before I bring, I don't kind of, when I'm talking about things like weight, I'm not diving straight in with like, let's talk about your weight. I'm talking about the person and the lifestyle and the bigger picture rather than the outcome, if that makes sense.
No, it does. So you would tend to be very much kind of patient-led, patient-centered, and I mean, your consultations with patients, they're more than brief interventions.
Yeah.
How long would you be with a patient?
So I have a lot of luxury because I work in private practice, so anywhere from an hour to 2 hours with one person. Yeah,
and that makes it. And then how often would you see that person regularly, or?
Yeah, I would see that person. So for example, that I had a client that came to my house last night to cook with me. So we spent 2 hours cooking and talking about food as part of her
therapy.
Yeah,
that's definitely a useful,
a luxury.
Yeah, certainly is. Okay, I want to just a little step back, just back to your training. Even during your dietetics degree, did you get any specific training around communication, or is that all kind of been learned on the job post grad?
I've learned everything about. I mean, we do get. So dietitians do have obviously the practical elements of their training, and you go into the NHS and you work with patients and you shadow other dietitians. But any views I have about patient communication, I think I very much have learned on my own. I definitely think that when I came out of training, it makes me cringe, but when I think back to, like attitudes I had, towards higher weight, that there was very much we would do these like junior level, like weight management clinics, for example, and people would come in and you weigh them and then you'd give them 3 things that they had to change in their diet or something, it's really basic stuff. And if people were coming back to you and telling you that they'd done them and they hadn't lost weight, you would just assume that they were lying. And that was something that that's part of the language and the discourse of dietetics. That wasn't something that I was kind of taught, but it was definitely something that was in the culture that you picked up from other dietitians that you then replicated in your clinics, definitely.
So what has changed for you kind of since then to now that means you don't do that anymore?
I think just a bit more experience. So I've been a dietitian now for 10 years, and I think, I don't want to say I'm special or anything, no, but I think like I like to learn about stuff, and I'm really a people person, so that has taken me down a slightly different route to some of my colleagues, I think. So I think just seeking it out and asking people questions and trying to understand more from a person's perspective has really helped me and then obviously discovering things like, so I discovered things like the Health at Every Size literature, the intuitive eating literature, and that helped me to kind of, even if I don't agree with everything, particularly in the Hays literature, it's given me, it gave me a lot of pause for thought, and that helped me reflect a lot on my own practice. So it was really personal development and CPD, I guess, and being exposed to the ideas by other dietitians that have gone through and done this work before me.
Okay. And does exposure to different types of patients kind of over your career make a difference?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I've worked all over the UK. So I've worked up in the north of Scotland and in the south of England, and I've worked in quite deprived areas as well as quite affluent areas. So I think it helps, but I think the biggest influence on me has been being able to branch out and network with other professionals from other disciplines as well. So I think discovering a lot of the kind of the sociology literature and speaking to people that have like sort of in-depth public health backgrounds, that sort of thing has really helped me to break out the dietetics bubble and stop thinking about just food. Because I think we're taught on courses about social determinants of health and all of this stuff, but it becomes a bit of, it's not really looked at in depth. It's just one of those things that you're told, but when it comes down to it, we're not focusing on that. We're focusing in on the food. So it's almost like it's just a forgotten part of the puzzle, if that makes sense. It's not the whole picture is presented to you, but because you're really in a reductionist kind of profession where you're going right into the food, that you forget about all of these things. And I think in time pressured environments in the NHS as well, it becomes a bit of a checkbox exercise.
Yeah, so through a varied career and then looking at other sources outside dietetics, kind of learn to really live that social determinants of health.
And speaking to people and understanding people's stories and and definitely the sociology people, there's a lot of sociologists out there that do an amazing kind of more like pulling people's stories out of the and explaining circumstances and actually giving a real life picture to what social determinants of health means, and that's all been really useful.
Okay. So kind of moving on then to specific examples, if you can, maybe if we think about, if you're talking to someone about binge eating, so try to recall a conversation that had helped to overall improve a patient's health. Tell me about that conversation and kind of the words and language that you've used and how you interacted. This is a
hard one. Yeah. I think, can I be generalist about this? Because
yes,
I have it. Yeah. So I think in a situation where a client would raise concerns or kind of anxiousness about their size of their body, particularly if they thought their body was too big or too fat or that kind of thing, I would probably ask them what they meant by that, why that was a problem, and then usually I would go down the route, particularly if they needed reassurance. I would just talk a little bit about body diversity. I'd talk about their condition and their mental health condition. And I talk about how they thought their mental health condition impacted on their health. And then they might bring up their weight again. And then we talk about the strategies that we were going to use moving forward to try and to mitigate the binge eating disorder and what that might feel like. And then I'd probably reassure them that, again, about body diversity, again, about their body being perfectly fine as it is, and that treatment might reduce their body weight, but it might also not reduce their body weight. And actually the most important thing, sometimes I bring it back to, depending on the person as well, I might talk to them about, would you rather continue down this road of binge eating and be a size whatever their ideal, because a lot of people have this ideal weight or size in their head, or would you rather just stay exactly as you are now and all of this noise, all of these feelings, all of these urges completely disappear? And usually that doesn't work for every person, but for some people that's quite striking. And really what I try and do is just take the focus off their weight and try and get them to refocus on the condition, the disorder, how they feel, what they can do to make themselves feel better, and fixing the mental health problem. And a bit of body acceptance stuff, really. I don't know if I'm being too vague.
No, that's good. So, I mean, in terms of dealing with binge eating disorder, I mean, is it generally people of higher weights with that disorder, or is it the fear of getting to a higher weight?
I'd say most people that I have dealt with binge eating disorder, not everybody is of higher weight, but a lot of people are of higher weight, and have got there through binge eating disorder. Yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of, I think you mentioned this earlier, in terms of maybe, talking to people about the health impacts of weight, do you kind of outline kind of risks, or do you outline rewards of, health behaviors, or what's your approach there?
My approach, I never really outline risks of higher weight, because I feel that body weight isn't something that, particularly in my patients, is something that they have any real control over. So I don't really highlight the risks of higher weight. I tend to focus in on health behaviors and how those health behaviors will make people feel, and also I tend to put that into context of the person as well. So for some people that might be running might be really helpful. For other people that might be completely off the cards, so it's all about kind of talking. It's more about getting them to decide and tell me what's important to them. So they make the priority list. They tell me, in my life, these are the things that are really important. And usually when we talk about things and we talk a bit about body weight, is not in those top three, particularly with people that I'm dealing with. Yeah.
And then if we were defining success for your clients and you working with your clients, what would that be?
Usually it's a much healthier relationship with food. So it's that food doesn't have any power. It doesn't over them. It doesn't take up most of their thought space, that they can move through the world thinking about their future and about their families and all the other things that are important to them, and they're not constantly thinking about food or fearing food or planning a binge or that kind of thing. And that's usually how we define success, is regaining control, I guess, and healing that, and hopefully for most people, healing some of those problems.
And in terms of your clients, is that somewhere you get to often, or is it always a work in progress?
It's often a work in progress. It's often a lot of the behaviours can be a coping mechanism. It's about packing up that toolbox as well as with other ways to cope. And there may be times where people relapse, but for the most part, it's not a linear process. People don't tend to get progressively better. They tend to be up and down and roundabout, but with a general progression forward. So it's a long process usually for a lot of people. It's quite intense, and it's not something you can fix, I don't think, 100%. I think it's always something that people will carry with them to a degree, and it's just getting them to a point where they can manage. And some people will put it behind them, but other people won't. And that expectation needs to be laid out as well.
Yeah, the managing. Yeah, that was one thing. Was, I mean, how do you deal with the managing of the expectations when you're working with clients?
A lot of open conversation is the honest answer. I mean, I do have that luxury of time. So again, I'm always asking questions. I'm not telling people what they should expect. I'm asking them how they feel, where they feel that they're at, what they're struggling with, what went well, what didn't go well. And if we find something that wasn't going so well, then we dig into that a little bit. And particularly with anorexia, that can be just reminding people, particularly depending on the stage of recovery, that they might be working in quite a brave space at the moment. So they might get, because they're leaning into that they might get more feelings of restriction, or they might get more feelings of urges to binge, or they might want to falsify their weight because they're in that kind of really hectic brain space because of the challenges that we're pushing forward with. So it's not something you can pass over on a leaflet. It's
definitely
it's a lot of open conversation.
It's a different space. So the kind of the last area is maybe to ask you to reflect on I suppose not so much conversations that haven't gone well, but probably episodes of care. If you think about maybe that it hasn't gone quite so well with a certain client, and maybe is there anything around frustration with lack of progress for you, or does that not really come into it for you?
I don't know if this is relevant. I had a really, really big incident recently where something went quite wrong, but it was with somebody with anorexia.
That's okay. Yeah.
So I had do you want me to tell you the story? Is that?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So I've got a young client who is about to go to university, and she took a year off, and during the beginning parts of this year off, it became apparent that she was quite unwell with anorexia, and I've been working with her alongside a consultant. And towards the middle of this year, she, maybe about 5 months ago, she wanted to go to backpacking to Indonesia. And I don't work with weight targets, really. But I was convinced by her parents and by her and by the psychologist, obviously I was complicit to this as well, to put in a weight target to try and get her to a safer weight to go traveling for 2 months. And we did a lot of prep work for this. So there was a lot of much more intensive meal plans with calorie targets, and some little test trips away where she went up to the Lake District and she did some walking, and it all went well, and she actually gained weight on some of these trips, and it was all very positive, and I felt that perhaps potentially that it was going to be fine. And actually it was a really stark reminder that weight is not a really good indicator of health, particularly in people with eating disorders. And she went away, and things did not go well, despite all the prep that we'd done about, the planning that we put, meticulous planning in place for where she was going to be and what she was going to choose, and foods in these countries and all sorts of stuff. And we ended up having to fly her home. So her parents had to basically go, she became a little bit psychotic, and her parents had to go and get her and bring her back. So that was and actually, thankfully now, happy ending. She is going to university this month, and we've got her back on track, and it's been a very painful process for everybody. But that was an incident where I focused purely on weight as a way to get her where she wanted to go, and maybe became a bit distracted from actually the purpose and the more holistic view of recovery with anorexia, and it backfired massively.
So was your assumption that when she was gaining weight, that was an indication of her being healthier?
I made the assumption. Yeah, I knew that she wasn't recovered, and we didn't. It wasn't part of a recovery plan. It was supposed to be part of a safety plan and a maintenance plan while she managed this trip. But because I think we got lulled into a false sense of security with her weight. Yeah. So what would you do differently now? That's always easy after hindsight and all that. So what would you do differently? I think I would have discouraged her from going. I think she was at a really critical point in her recovery. With hindsight, I think it was a bad idea to go, and actually it caused her a lot of pain, and set her back by at least 2 or 3 months, to unpack all of that. And actually it took me I didn't think actually that she would work with me again. When she came back, she was so angry with me, particularly so angry with me, not because of her recovery was at the point. Obviously she was very not in her right mind, but she was angry that I'd indicated to her parents that I thought that that it was becoming unsafe, and that she'd been pulled back, and she was just, I didn't think our clinical relationship was going to recover. So I think I wouldn't have advised her going. I probably would have put my foot down and probably continued along the path that we were going, which is one where we didn't have a weight target, and we were focused more on the behaviours and feelings around food rather than the actual weight gain at that point.
Yeah, hindsight's always great.
Yeah, it was very traumatic.
Yeah. Sounds like it. And then in terms of, again, this might not be relevant to your work, but even just the wider kind of aspect or perspective on it, the impact of weight stigma. Does that ever kind of manifest it in your practice, or?
Well, definitely. I think particularly in anorexia recovery, it's a huge thing, because people need to gain weight. There's a massive fear of fat. There's a fear of fatness, and then there's this kind of idea of, you know, gain weight but not too much. So there's like, you know, BMI targets of like 18 or 19, and actually they're terrible indicators of recovery for anorexia. You know, they're terrible. They're really unreliable, and so I think it impacts not just patient recovery, but practitioner attitudes as well. You know, people like overshooting. Then there's the other issue of high weight anorexia. So people having anorexia that are in bigger bodies and not being diagnosed or getting the correct treatment because they're not deemed to be sick enough or low enough weight. So it impacts in lots of ways.
Practitioner attitude, just tell me a bit more about that.
Which attitude?
Practitioner attitude. So you said that the kind of weight stigma impacts on practitioner attitude.
Yeah, so you know, you'll get an attitude from the practitioner to the eating disorder patient of, you know, it's important that you gain weight, but that you don't get fat. So that can be an implicit bias from a practitioner that has fat phobia, and it can be really damaging because it's reinforcing the restriction narrative. It's reinforcing the person's fear of body fat and weight gain, which feeds their eating disorder. So it's quite it's quite a difficult line to tread, particularly if you're working with other practitioners that have that fear of body fat. And I guess the other one is from a practitioner's point of view, particularly in diagnosis of anorexia, it's just not diagnosed in people that aren't thin enough. Even though that's not a diagnosis criteria specifically anymore, it's still deemed to be, you know, to get treatment in the NHS, for example, you have to be very thin. That sort of thing. So it impacts on patient care in lots of different ways.
And then in terms of your own development, I mean, would you have said at any point you were more weight bias orientated than you are now?
Oh my goodness, yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think when I finished training, I was the epitome of a dietitian. I was, you know, if people ate their vegetables and did their exercise, then they'd be thin, you know. That was, you know, and I think that you still see that played out in from dietitians and, you know, qualified health professionals now. People genuinely, you know, you hear the 2 biscuits narrative, you know, cut 2 biscuits a day out and you'll lose this many kilos, and it's the understanding of weight and weight science within healthcare professionals that are dealing with weight and weight science is shockingly poor.
So that's me, basically, all the questions. So do you have anything else you want to add? Anything I haven't covered or insight?
No, I don't think so.
I've covered everything, have I?
I don't think so.
Okay, cool. All right, well, listen, thank you. That's me. That's us all done.
Brilliant.
So, I mean, what I do is I'll transcribe the interview. I'm very happy to give you a copy if that's what you want and stuff. So
it's fine. It's fine, don't worry.
But as I say, I'm going to be, I think the good thing is that getting input from someone like you who's specialistly trained in this area will kind of help frame other interviews as well, because obviously you've had a different type of training than, say, a practice nurse or a GP, and I think all of those experiences together are kind of useful when you look at training that people, you know, so.
Yeah, I hope that was useful. I don't know. I feel like I was waffling.
No, it was all useful. It definitely was all useful. So, thank you, Helen. I really.
No worries. Yeah, it's really nice to talk to you. I hope you get home sometime soon. You're not stuck in that office all night.
No, I'll be going in a few minutes. So, thank you. I'll see you.
Yeah, no worries. See you later, Fiona. Bye.